So hello, everybody. This is Michael McFall, the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute. I'm just waiting a little bit as everybody logs on. I see the numbers are jumping up. We're at 150 right now and climbing. Thank you all for joining us again. If this is your first time with us, this is our Friday afternoon summer seminar series at the Freeman Spogli Institute. Normally, for those of you who don't know FSI that well, seminars are normally located and organized by our individual centers, but beginning with COVID, we decided to do a institute-wide discussion, and we've decided to continue that through the summer on a variety of topics, including one of several seminars that we'll do over the summer with respect to racial justice. We are delighted today that we have Professor Clayborne Carson with us. He is the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor of History here at Stanford University. And he's also the founder of Stanford's Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. I think it's fair to say Professor Carson is probably one of, if not the most expert person in the world on Martin Luther King. I was just looking at this fantastic book, Clay. You can't see it because I'm virtual, but it's Martin's Dream. A memoir, My Journey and the Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Clay will start us off to speak about a few remarks he has on King's global vision and for racial justice. Maybe he'll want to say some things about some discussions about the Martin Luther King Institute here on campus as well. But I want to emphasize we want to try to have a conversation. We want to try to get to as many questions as we can. So I encourage you to go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens and submit your questions as we roll through this discussion. And I will try to get to as many of them as I can. Let me, before handing it over to Clay, remind you that next week we will be here again, same time, same place. The topic will be reimagining policing and a look at an evidence and comparative perspective of some of the policy reforms currently under consideration, both here in the United States and throughout the world. That discussion will be led by Professors Beatrice Magaloni and Jeremy Weinstein. I promise you it will be worth tuning into. And to remind you, for all of FSI's commentary and analysis on everything, including the fight for racial justice and including recordings of these seminars, please visit our website, fsi.stanford.edu. Again, thank you everybody for being here. We're now well over 200, Clay, just so you know. I think that's because of you and not me. And so let me hand it over to you to get us started.
Well, first of all, hello to everyone. And this is a real pleasure. This is perhaps a new audience, although I can't be sure these days because I just spoke to an audience earlier this week of the people who had done master's programs with the MLA program. And that was also a wonderful event. It's always nice in some ways to be talking to an audience who has personal memories of the 20th century. One of the aspects of teaching in the 21st century, and especially as we start moving forward, is that many of the young people who were involved in some of these movements, their life experience is in the 21st century. And so maybe one of the ways in which we could start this discussion is that it's forced me to think a lot about how my teaching about Martin Luther King and the movements of the 20th century have affected the way in which I view what's going on with Black Lives Matter and all the movements that we see around us. And one of the thoughts that has come to my mind is that I was 19 when I attended the March on Washington in 1963. And it was obviously a life-changing event for me. I don't think I would be doing what I'm doing now if not for coming there and the people I met. Shortly before the march, I met Stokely Carmichael, at that time a student at Howard University who was kind of leaving school to go and join the movement as a field secretary, and later on that year, I met Bob Moses, who was one of the key figures in the student movement and what the organization's Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, about which I wrote my first book. So when I look at what's happening, I see, again, a period where young people are taking the lead. It doesn't always happen that way in social movements. Obviously, in the abolitionist movement or in some parts of the labor movement, you have people who are at a later age stage in their lives taking the lead. But this is a period when there is a distinctive youth culture. And so when I compare well, let's just talk about one of the things that I compare, and that is the scale of the movement compared with what I experienced at the March on Washington. And as a 19-year-old, I would have never assumed when I was there with 200,000 people that I had anything to do with organizing that. I would later find out that there were many veteran organizers, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, these people had spent their life in various movements, labor movement and civil rights struggles. And, they took months to organize that. But within days of George Floyd's murder, young people mobilized something larger than the March on Washington that very quickly became a global series of movements. And that in itself is something that I would see as a difference, that just the difference in scale. But I think what's similar is the fact that young people are pushing older reformers. That in part what the student movement was in the 1960s were young people pushing King, pushing the established civil rights leaders, and saying you're not going fast enough. You're not putting enough pressure on at that time the Kennedy administration. You're not putting enough pressure on these institutions that can change the world. And so we'll put pressure on it. We will put our bodies on the line. You don't see a lot of civil disobedience in the way, for example, the young people in SNCC using civil disobedience as their distinctive weapon for change, because no one's more willing to go to jail than young people. For some I would put myself in that category during the 60s. It was easier for us to go to jail than it was for older people who had families and responsibilities. So that's definitely something that brings these two eras together. But on the other hand, I think that if you look at what's happening these days and try to imagine the life experiences of these young people who are spearheading these protests, that's quite different from, we were products of the 1950s. We were products of an era when not very much was happening politically. It was, looking back, it was Eisenhower kind of personified that era. And what we see for young people today is an era of really momentous change, that their life experience is very, very different from someone who would have come of age, say, during the Cold War, someone who had come of age even in the 1990s. What they've seen is a lot of uncertainty coming from various places. Economic uncertainty, the recession, Great Recession, the way in which that did happen suddenly, and it really changed a lot in the world. And it also drew more attention to the economic inequalities in American society. The Occupy movement would be an early example of that. And of course, the race issue um, coming to the fore, not just with George Floyd, but going back to Michael Brown um, and even the election of the first Black president. You know, all of this suggesting that race is one of the basic aspects of the changes going on during their lifetime. So you have many of these students, their first experience of American politics is having a Black president, having a Barack Obama, but also having a political order that is not moving very rapidly. It's not responding to change. Also having the uncertainty about their own future. One of the things that I see is that the changing attitude about what education, getting a college education in particular, means. For me, it was a very promising possibility because I could work my way through school. I worked my way through UCLA. Today, that would be impossible to do. You know, no young person, unless they just happen to have a job that paid a lot of money, could get through UCLA, get 3 degrees, and come out with minimal debt, as I was able to do. Today, there's that sense that even if I get an education, I'll start my life with debt. So that kind of uncertainty is certainly something that I see fueling these protests. And it also is one of the reasons why I think these kinds of protests are going to be a continuing element in American life. It's not going to end when we have police reform. It's not going to end when we have a new president. It's not going to end because these are more structural things that are going to be much more difficult to change. And you know, so I think that aspect of it is something that I would see is similar to the 60s, that you had a generation of people who grew up on protest that shaped the rest of their lives. And I think this is another one of those kinds of moments. Now, the question to be answered, and we can get into a discussion about that, is in the 1960s, from the March on Washington through the mid-1960s, what I saw was the political establishment finally responding with major pieces of legislation. We can look at that period of 64, 65, the passage of major civil rights legislation, immigration legislation, war on poverty, you know, all of these sorts of things in that brief window of time when Lyndon Johnson had majorities in both houses of Congress, able to push things through. And so we saw these reforms happening as the result of our activity. Again, this is my guess. The younger people protesting today will not see that responsiveness from the system. I'm assuming that Joe Biden will be elected, but the possibility of having both houses of Congress and a vision. You know, one of the things that you know, it's often commented that notion that the crisis is too valuable an opportunity to lose. I think that with the 60s, an older generation of reformers, the Hubert Humphreys, the Lyndon Johnsons, the people who had seen the Great Depression and the kind of New Deal legislation, they had a vision of what change would look like. And so when they got their moment to deliver that change, something like Medicare, you know, all of these, they already had a sense of, yes, if we have this opportunity, we will pass this. We will get these reforms through. I don't see that in this particular moment. But there's obviously people who are visionaries and will want to try to get, for example, get closer to national health care, something to deal with the uncertainties about higher education and the cost of higher education. I certainly hope that these major issues are addressed fairly quickly if Biden comes in, but by no means is he a visionary, and I think that it's almost inevitable that the political system will fall far behind the expectations of young people. So so that's just a guess. Beyond that, I guess the only thing I would say to start the discussion is that institutions, one of the elements of the youth movement that I think is important to note is that it's quite possible that young people, and I'm speaking of people in their teens and early 20s now, have more in common with each other throughout the world than with older people. There is a youth culture that is global. You can see it in music, you can see it in just the styles of protest. And what I believe that will indicate is that tension between the unresponsiveness of government in general, and maybe with few exceptions throughout the world, and the need for immediate response to the issues raised by young people. I think that's going to be a source of tension and a spur to further protests going into the future. Where that will end, I suspect, well, one ways in which I think it will go is that increasingly the demand will not be for civil rights, but human rights. That the focus on citizenship rights, which was a necessary component of a world where if you have human rights, it's going to be governments that will enforce those rights and protect those rights. I think we've kind of reached the limit of what most nations are willing to protect. And we don't have any functioning organization, certainly not the UN, certainly not the NGOs that are out there, that will have the power to do very much about human rights on a global level. The one area where I do see hope is in terms of education. I think because education can be delivered through digital media like we're using right now, it is more feasible that we could move closer to a human right to a basic education. And maybe the pandemic has kind of opened eyes and doors to that possibility, because out of necessity, we're going to have to experiment this fall with education at practically every level being done virtually. So we're conducting a huge experiment that we would never have conducted on whether it is possible to deliver a decent, high quality education through means that are more cost effective, quite to put it bluntly. That the idea of education having to happen always in a classroom, I think we're hopefully moving beyond that notion, and understanding that there's other ways to bring that about. So yeah, those are the initial thoughts I have, and I don't definitely want to monopolize, because part of this is so I'll get to know some of the people who are associated with FSI and what are their concerns.
That was fantastic, Clay. Professor Carson, Dr. Carson, thank you for all of
Just
that. I have
call,
a
just call Clay.
I just want to make sure. I just want to make sure. I like calling you Clay. I used to play basketball with Clay. He doesn't even know this, by the way. When I was here as a PhD student at CSAC, which is one of the centers, Clay, do you remember you used to play basketball out there by the Stern dorms? You
I,
don't even
I,
remember.
I used to play basketball wherever I could find a pickup game.
Well,
So,
we always called you Professor
there, there,
Carson back then, just so you know.
no, if you remember, people called me Doc on the court.
That's right. That's right. I do remember that. I do remember that.
And
The
but a lot
questions
of
are,
I had no idea I was a Stanford professor either. So,
well, some of us knew. We have lots of questions here. They're stacking up. Some are giant and some are specific. I want to start with a couple of my questions just to get us going, but I encourage people to weigh in the Q&A box, and I'll try to aggregate them as we go along. Just a couple of historical questions that compare and contrast with the 60s versus now. You said something very interesting about how quickly these protests happen now. How do you explain that? Is that one could think that maybe that has to do with just the level of frustration, and so is an explosion. A second explanation might be that it has to do with technology. Why do you think it was so fast this time around? And related to that, just for those of us who don't know the 60s as well as you do, can you give us a little compare and contrast of the demographics? And I mean ethnic, socioeconomic, national. You know, I've read reports. You know, there's even been protests in rural areas, including my home state of Montana. How does that compare with what was going on in the 60s? So two questions: why so fast, and then what are the demographics of the two different movements so far in? Because we're just very obviously early on in this stage.
uh, it's definitely a lot to do with technology and the fact that access to, you know, any movement relies on communications and whatever the technology is. And there's two elements: not only the speed of information flow, but also the fact that it's not controlled. It's not, you know, when you're talking about the 1960s, uh, the, the whole emphasis of the Southern movement was to get the national press to care. Because if you didn't get on the evening news, you know, it didn't really happen.
Right.
You know, so a movement like Birmingham, you know, all we remember is, oh yes, finally it gets to the front pages of the newspapers. Finally it gets on, and when we're talking about the evening news, it would be 3 networks producing a half an hour of news. So now when you think of all the channels that people, very few people watch the evening news anymore, especially young people. They get their news through their phones. And so it's much faster. It's more, it's a more flat kind of communications, not hierarchical. So I think that contributes not simply to the speed of information about, you know, the murder of George Floyd, but the way in which you can respond to that and, you know, share not just information but an attitude about it.
Right.
And I think that there's a lot of connections to the social media platforms that we have. You know, I think I feel very old right now when I say I use Facebook, and my kids are like, you know, you still use that, and so it's you know, that means that you're going to get a lot of information flowing to specific age groups, and we're getting down to what are the 13, 14, 15-year-olds, what are they responding to? And you know, one of the things that I found very interesting about just going to the Palo Alto protest and the fact that it was organized by two 18-year-olds and two 20-year-olds.
Right.
And there were a lot of younger people there carrying signs, and you know, the fact that they were 12 years old didn't necessarily mean that they were just there with their parents. Some of them had signs that I could see were made by them.
Right.
Now, where does that come from? And we're talking about Palo Alto. So it's an interesting phenomenon, and I think what will happen, and you begin to see it, is that the age of activism is going down.
Right.
You know, for me to engage in my first protest, significant protests, when I went to the March on Washington at 19, that would be old today to have your first political activity. And, that's very much more likely to happen in high school or maybe even in junior high school.
It's interesting. A second question I had related is about leadership. Some people say that there's not a clear leader of this movement right now, and some say that's a good thing. Some say that's a bad thing in terms of mobilization. And in particular, this comes up when people talk about translating protest into legislative change that you talked about from the 60s. I wonder what your perspective on that is. Who is the Martin Luther King? Did we know who was the Martin Luther King early on in the protests? And just talk a little bit about leadership and active legislative change, or change any way you want to talk about it in a compare and contrast way, again, the 60s versus now.
Well, I think there's a different definition of leadership. When we're talking about Martin Luther King, we're talking about kind of charismatic style leadership. And I think that was overrated even in the 1960s.
Interesting.
As I've often pointed out, he didn't organize the Montgomery bus boycott. He didn't start the sit-ins. He didn't start he didn't even participate in the freedom rides. The person who is the anointed leader is often given a more powerful role than they actually exercise. Martin Luther King did not initiate the Selma to Montgomery March, and he was in no way in control of it. So I think that there was that tendency to say, oh, he's the person who is really making all this happen, when that wasn't true then. Now it's even less true. Now it's one of the things that I think is really the case is that most of the people in the 1960s, they got their background through some connection with the American left. That's where they got their model for activism. Even the notion of a sit-in, was an updated version of the sit-down strikes of the 1930s. So there was that relationship between the old left and the new left. Now, after the 60s, you've had a proliferation of other kinds of movements. The feminist movement, the movement for gay rights, all of these kind of different identities that have become more evident. Within each of those movements, you have leadership developing. So one of the things I've noticed about Black Lives Matter is that there's a purposeful suspicion of that kind of charismatic leadership that would have been effective. Because what does that represent in terms of, is it going to be a male? Is it going to be someone who, there's all kinds of reasons why you would want to play down leadership of a movement that is very heterogeneous. Who is going to lead such a movement? And that's a strength in the sense that it means that it can't be easily suppressed or controlled.
Right.
I think what you're getting at, though, is that question of, okay, how do you translate that into lasting change? And that's again one of the things I'm very concerned about, because as a historian, you see that these moments of change are very few and very short. You know, I didn't know when in 1965 that that period of major legislation passing through Congress, say by 1967, that once that period was over, it was over. You know, that we weren't going to see another period like that, well, in a lot of people's lifetime.
Right. But at the moment, Clay, did you think that that was going to continue? That's really interesting to me. You thought, well, we've won these,
course,
and now we're just going to do more, and then it froze. Right.
yeah, yes, of course. As an activist, your activism doesn't
Right.
end, your
Right.
idealism doesn't end. So of course you have this vision of, oh, we're going to bring about the utopia. We're going to solve all these social problems, and we'll stay active until they do. But you begin to realize, unfortunately, that those moments when you actually have access to power are very brief.
Interesting.
I mean, in all of American history, you know, when we can look at the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, or the actually right after the Civil War, you know, the period of the mid 1930s with you know, the I guess from the late 1930s and the mid 1960s, and maybe now. These moments are rare when you get this kind of momentum for change.
Important thing to think about. So I've got three more questions, but I'm not going to ask them because we're being overwhelmed with other questions. So I want to pivot to them first. At some point towards the end, maybe, I really want to get back to your very interesting comment about a global youth movement and those transnational connections, not necessarily mediated by governments. But I want to get to some of the questions here. And one is very much related to what we're talking about right now. It's from Jesse Brunner from the Human Rights Center here at Stanford. Let me just read it. It's a long question, but I think it's a very important one. We often see a lot of, quote, mission creep during widespread social movements. People either taking on too many policies at once, or the combination of disparate human rights issues in a way that detracts from progress on any single issue. Do you have any lessons you can share from the civil rights movement on how we can keep folks engaged squarely on the issue of BLM, Black Lives Matter, at this moment in a way that's most effective and impactful? Really hard, but very important question.
You know, I would not be as worried about that in the sense that I think the questioner is. I think that there is you know, you get what you can, and what you get is important to some aspect of the movement. You know, and it's not always on point. I mean, it's going to be, you know, for example, if you were concerned in the 60s about the issue of poverty, you would have probably come away that we didn't get very much, you know, on that issue. You know, I look upon the war on poverty as kind of a minor skirmish, and we surrendered.
Right.
You know, that
right.
It never really gained ground. While at least on the voting rights issue, we did gain some ground. On the civil rights desegregation issues, we did gain some ground. And so if you had come into the 1960s, like King did, for example, his major issue was economic. You know, he was a social gospel minister. He was kind of drafted into the civil rights movement. You know, I quote a paper that he wrote when he was, well, I guess he was 19, like I was, and he was starting divinity school, and was asked, like, what is your agenda as a minister? And he said, economic insecurity, slums, you know, those kinds of issues. Um, what is he doing in 1968? He's working on those kinds of issues. So
Right.
that was always at the top of his agenda. So for Martin Luther King, the fact that it all got boiled down to civil rights reforms, that's one of the reasons why I'm uneasy even calling him a civil rights leader. If he had been, he might have retired in 1965
Right.
because
Right.
that was as far as you're going to get on those issues.
Right.
And, but instead, I think he became even more active after that, as he took a look at these other issues. So I think that we always have, and those of us who consider ourselves progressives, we always want, you know, these changes to be on the issues that we consider the central issues. And those of us influenced by the traditional left, those are going to be the hard economic issues, who gets what. And we get kind of disappointed when the movement gets distracted into the more symbolic issues. And but that's what other people might see as the, you know, if you are if you're gay and someone else is saying, well, you should be focusing on how to bring about economic change. Why? You know, what is the issue that's going to affect you the most going forward? And that's a choice that is different for every group. I think what is remarkable is the times when you can get some agreement, say like on police reform,
Right.
on mass incarceration. I think that those are issues where it seems to me we can make some real progress. I don't know if we will, you know, because we don't have a lot of models of how policing is done elsewhere that can be imported easily into the United States. You know, it's striking to me that, you know, 1,000 people get killed by police in the United States. And I looked on Wikipedia and it said that the number in Great Britain is 3. You know, and you know, there's got to be something that can be done to make us more like Western Europe, basically. You know,
Uh-huh.
the Denmark model. If everybody could be Denmark, they probably had 0 people killed by police last year. So, but whether we'll get there, make progress on those areas, you know, I'd like to see some experimentation. You know, what are alternative models? Let's try it. You know, right here in Menlo Park during the 1970s, they did make an effort to experiment with different kinds of policing. I used to live there during that time, and you know, they disarmed the police, or at least I don't know if they still carried weapons, but they didn't have uniforms. You know, you try to make police more like community workers. It was unsuccessful because other police departments didn't relate well to them, to
Right.
Menlo Park policemen. But we should be looking at those kinds of models and trying them out.
Thank you. Great answer. And for those who are interested in comparative policing, please tune in next week. Our 2 speakers will be looking at different countries and what they've been doing.
Like to see
Including from Brazil, by the way, where they look closer to the American problems as opposed to Europe. But both Jeremy and Beatrice will be addressing those comparative ideas as well. So come back next Friday. Clay, we got a lot of work to do here, though. There are many great questions, so I'm going to be faster. Chris Peacock asks, related to what you were just talking about, religion and the church played an important role in advancing racial justice in the 60s. How has that changed? How have changes in religious culture impacted racial justice?
Well, I think that, again, it might be misleading to say, well, religion in a broad sense, yes, obviously. Martin Luther King came to it from a religious perspective. But religion was much more institutionalized then. That you had national bodies, you know, a National Council of Churches. You had more of a sense of these institutions that had power. But now the institutionalized church that we would remember from the 1960s has been replaced by a different model of religion, which is not very hierarchical at all. I mean, you wouldn't have, you know, at the March on Washington, you had leaders of this denomination, leaders of that denomination, and they, you know, their presence kind of suggested that these denominations all supported the march. And I can't imagine an event that would be comparable today. There would be no one with that kind of authority within, say, the Baptist Church, or the, you know, that we're talking about much more of a decentralized churches, and often it is the mega church at the local level that is generating the energy, and you know that's not likely to, you know, even among evangelicals, there's no Billy Graham, there's no,
Right.
you know, who kind of represents the movement as a whole. So I don't anticipate that, and I think that there's a lot of movement among young people away from organized religion.
Interesting. Lots of questions here about your lessons for young leaders right now. There's 3 or 4 questions asking for that. I don't know if these are young people asking or they're their parents asking. How would you answer that question? And I think part of your answer might be like, we should listen to them, not them listen to us. But what would be some of your advice?
It'll be along those lines. I mean, I remember having a wonderful dialogue with Elisa Garza, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter. And we had a public talk in San Francisco, and there were several hundred people there. And it was just the 2 of us exchanging ideas. And I tried to purposely avoid that notion of the young. These sometimes are set up as the older generation advising the younger generation.
Right.
And that's going to get you nowhere. You know, that any younger generation is going to say, if you guys were so wise, why are we dealing with these problems? You know,
Right, right.
So why should we listen to you? You haven't dealt with them. And but I think that there are some, you know, just practical ideas that you can exchange if you do it in the right manner. I took part in another one, and I won't embarrass the people who were there, but it was kind of again one of these things that are set up of the people with gray hair talking to the people who hair hasn't gone gray yet, and the younger people organized it so that there was a 2-minute limit on what anyone could say, and then you had to hand the mic to somebody else. And guess who had a very difficult time dealing with that? It was, I was so embarrassed for my generation. I mean, the rules were made very, very clear. And some very prominent people who I greatly respect just could not deal with that. That they did not want to give up the mic, you know, and I found it embarrassing, actually, because, you know, that this was supposed to be an exchange. But I think that it is good to have these kinds of dialogues. You know, I learned so much during the 60s from people whose experiences came out of the 30s and 40s,
Right.
and 50s. And I remember those conversations I had with, you know, I could name a few of them, but I mean, Ella Baker, for example, you know, a person who was so influential in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Her experience was kind of formulated in the 1930s. um, forming cooperatives and, doing things like that. And then she went to work for the NAACP in the 40s and formed King's headquarters in the 1950s. And, a woman like that, wow, I could spend hours just talking with her. But part of it was that you could talk with her in a way that was not like, you have all the answers and I'm going to follow your advice all the time. It was more we can learn from each other,
Right.
and that's very important. People like Howard Zinn had a great uh, influence. A lot of the individuals who came out of those early movements, particularly when they came out with that idea of being an organizer rather than a leader. Organizing is often the skills needed to do it transfer really well from generation to generation. The ones who are really good at local organizing. So I'm hoping that these kinds of conversations are happening. Actually, I've been involved in some just this summer. So
Great answer. And I love the emphasis on organizers versus leaders and understanding and appreciating those different sets of skills. We have lots of people from around the world with us. Some of them are asking very difficult questions, and so I'm going to ask the question out of politeness from John from Conakry, Guinea right now, from the Ministry of Security and Civil Protection, just so you know, he's with us right now. And he's up late, so I want to make sure I'm going to ask both of his questions, but I want you to focus on the second one. The first one is, when will racism has ended in the world in general and the United States in particular? So take a stab at that if you'd like. But the second one I think is important because there's others from other people asking something similar. Why only the African Americans who are victims of police brutality in the United States?
Oh, uh, those are tough ones. Well, I think I'll take up the second one, and then I'll probably forget the first one.
First one's pretty hard. Yeah, we can come back to the first one later.
Yeah, but I think that yeah, let's go to the first one, because I think that their racism, obviously people can overcome attitudes, they can change. And one of the things that we, in the discussion that went on just this morning with my international group, the whole question of whether Gandhi should be condemned for his racist statements when he came to Africa, my attitude about that is, some of the strongest advocates for civil rights were white Southerners who changed, who rejected their own past and gave up that sense of privilege that they brought into the movement, an understanding that couldn't have been gained from someone who kind of sees the race issue from a distance. And so I think it's often people who are, we all have a baggage. Look, sitting here, I've often used the term of looting. We're dealing with people who were looted from Africa, land that was looted from the native people here, and Americans' imperialism around the world that looted other countries. And so we have a lot to deal with, black and white. All of us need to recognize that none of us are innocent. When you watch right here in Palo Alto, what people do when you just propose something like having senior housing in their neighborhood. And just how self-interest can be cloaked into something that is not, oh, well, I'm not against them. It's just that I have to defend my own self-interest. And that's what racism is. I mean,
Right.
it is an identification of your self-interest as a white person. And you can either leave that behind or not, but don't consider it anything other than racism is the consequence of your action. It's not the motivational oftentimes.
Right.
And we sometimes make that mistake that all races have to be mean people who hate Black people. If the consequence of your action that you should be able to anticipate has then you have to own up to that. And I think the societies that are going to get through this the best are the ones that are able to own up, and just say, look, we're not innocent. It's right here in Silicon Valley. You have people who voted overwhelmingly for Obama. And so they kind of represent a kind of progressive attitude. But looking at the thousands of people who have been forced to leave this area and can't come to this area, if this is liberalism, would you buy it? Would you see that as the most progressive attitudes that you can have? To some degree, we solve the problem of race by not having race. A lot of people of other races, other than, we have people from other countries, but in terms of the American race problem, you can be very liberal because you don't see it.
Yes. It's a great observation. We're down to.
I have forgotten the other
That's
questions.
let's go to a couple more because I got a lot of questions and we only have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask one big question about Gandhi because you mentioned him, and then the last question is going to be about the future of the Martin Luther King Institute. There are several questions here on that, but before I get to that one, James Dinwiddie, who has asked several great questions, by the way, James. Sorry, I'm only getting to one. But let me just read this one because it's a bit, well, let me just read it. Dr. Martin Luther King's, while at theological seminary, became enamored with Gandhi's formulation of satyagraha, I think, roughly translated as truth power or truth force. Forgive me if I mispronounce that word. The concept became the core concept and driving idea of King's life, along with other elements of Gandhi's political philosophy, such as nonviolence, non-cooperation. Do you see this idea of, quote, truth force in the youth culture movements of Black Lives Matter?
I think you see elements of it, and I say it in that guarded way because I don't think in general young people have spent a lot of time studying Gandhi's ideas. It's kind of been passed down through a lot of different filters. But I do think that the idea that where does the moral force of the movement come from? That's the
Right.
essential question. That how can you confront these major moral questions? And I think in some sense what Gandhi is saying with truth force is with honesty. That part of what I see him doing is stripping away the facade and getting down to the reality that all of us have some complicity And, it's ironical in some ways that Gandhi's being condemned for things that he, in his honesty, said, yes, I did that. And, most of the bad things that people have charged him with, you find him writing about them in his own journals. So,
Interesting.
so part of what his life was about was searching for that essential honesty with oneself. And it's a painful process. It's not something that that um, it's some aspects of it are not pretty. Um, I I think that King's great speeches, like his unfulfilled dream speech that he gave toward the end of his life. It's that unveiling of oneself, of trying to understand. That gives you empathy for understanding. Like our president doesn't want to ever admit a mistake because that's a vulnerability that he won't allow himself. And what is interesting to me about nonviolence as a technique is that in essence, it's allowing people to come to terms with themselves. It's a challenge to them of, what, when you resolve that issue within yourself, you find that it gives you a strength to go and change the world, because you're using, I think so many of the things that are wrong with us are the things that limit us, that make us cautious, that make us um, place too much emphasis on the superficial rather than the the depth of our own identity. And so I think that a lot of what nonviolent training is trying to get to that point where you are your best self, and that's a search. Finding who we are at our best is something that requires that, and it takes a lot of bravery to do it.
Right.
And but once you get there, you find that you have an impact in the world because it comes through. It is a force in the world. So I think that's hopefully something that I hope will be taught in the schools.
Right.
I have been to a Gandhian school in India, and it's an amazing place because it teaches kids from kindergarten through high school to live that kind of life.
Interesting. So we're out of time, but I want to ask this last question because there's several of them, but I'm just going to read from Jim Snyder. How ambitious are the Institute's plan for a facility in scale with Dr. King?
Well, I think that can be misunderstood. I've heard people say, do you want a large building on the campus and all that sort of stuff? I say, yeah, sure. That would be nice to give Martin Luther King the visibility he deserves. But I think in part it's Martin Luther King is going to do fine without it. And so it really means, I would translate that question in terms of what does Stanford want to represent to the world? The reason why I hope that, that we'll get to the point where Stanford would want to say, look, King is part of the better part of ourselves. Let's put that front and center. Let's not hide it in a small set of offices on the edge of campus. And I think I'm hoping that they'll make that decision, that this represents, because if it's simply symbolic and Stanford goes on as before, and it's kind of a facile way of of responding to this historical moment. You know, that, you know, when Princeton took the name off, Woodrow Wilson's name off the Woodrow Wilson Center, will the Woodrow Wilson Center actually change in any significant way? That's the more important thing.
Right.
And so I'm hoping that, you know, that gets back to that whole notion of the crisis is too important to waste. This is a crisis moment in American history. Don't waste it. Do something that 20 years from now we'll look back and say, yeah, we took that opportunity to change the history of Stanford in a significant way that is still, we can still feel it 20 years later. You know, that to me is what I'd like to see happen. And that's what I've been spending a lot of Zoom meetings trying to achieve over the last couple of months.
Well, Clay, first of all, thank you for joining us for this hour. We'll do it again, of course, but the end note that you just concluded this session with, I think was brilliant and a challenge to us all to take advantage of this moment, crisis opportunity to do something big, not only for our country and the world, but for our very local community here at Stanford. So thank you for challenging us all, and thank you for joining the FSI Friday at 1 seminar series. To the rest of you, and to those of you I didn't get your questions to, we'll try to aggregate them somehow, and maybe I'll try to get Professor Carson to respond to a few of them directly. But come back next week for our next seminar series, as I said before, with Professor Magaloni and Weinstein talking about policing reform and comparative perspective. Bye-bye. Have a great weekend, everybody.